Welcome everyone to the Montessori Family Life webinar series. I'm Lorna McGrath and I'm your host. I'm glad you're with us today. If you're returning to us, thank you for coming back. If you're new, we welcome you to the broadcast. I'm real happy to have a couple of members of our team with us today. Jonathan Wolf, who is a Montessori educator, an author, an international speaker, and movie expert. So if you ever need to know, just ask Jonathan. Margot Garfield Anderson is with us today. She's up there in the storms in New Jersey. So she may pop in and out because she doesn't have any electricity. So Margot, we appreciate you coming for this event since you're a little bit under the weather, shall we say? Okay.
Right.
Yeah, Margot works at the Montessori Foundation. She's worked there for many, many years, does pretty much everything there, and including much of our marketing, our conferences, membership, all kinds of things. So Margot, thank you so much for being with us today. And I would like to welcome very much Dr. Val Wise back to us. Thank you for coming today. This is her second time around this summer, and we really appreciate it. Val has a doctorate in education. She is an educational consultant, and she is an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. We invited her, and she accepted, thank you, to come and join us because she really has a lot of expertise in social justice and equity. And so she is really the one who knows everything. and the three of us will join in where we can. So she's going to be talking today about inner preparation. The title of this webinar is Parenting Toward Anti-Racism. And so Val, thanks for coming. We're ready to go ahead and get started. So here we are.
Well, thank you all. I so enjoy being part of this conversation. I love Montessori and what Montessori means to families. We started talking a few weeks ago about preparing the child and making sure that we're helping to secure the future for children, helping them to become social justice advocates, if you will. But what we really needed to talk about, and I love kind of pinging off of what Jonathan always talks about, is the fact that in order for our children to embrace this, we have to really first look at ourselves. Parents are the first teachers. We are the role models for our children, and they gain so much, not just from what we say, but what we do. And I always like to use this as an analogy because I raised three beautiful, fantastic kids. I mean, we all do. They are highly successful, marvelous, just wonderful kids. And they became, even though two of them had significant learning disabilities, they became really avid readers. And you wonder, how did that happen? And as I look back over the raising of my children, what I realized is that my husband and I are extremely avid readers. So although each of them had to have some support with reading, well, two of them, the boys anyway, not my daughter, but the reason they became is because their house was full with reading, that we read all the time to them, to each other, that in any opportunity we have a book. For us, my husband and I, a vacation is having a good book. So that is the kind of thing I'm hoping that we're thinking about when we become parents, and we're thinking about how do we raise children who are embracing a social justice mindset, as well as who are anti-racist themselves. So it really is our own inner preparation. And when I think about this, I think about it, and as I was preparing for this, I thought, you know, actually there are 3 B's. And the 3 B's are 1, becoming knowledgeable, and 2, becoming aware of bias, and then 3, becoming an ally. And let's talk about each one of them, but I wanted to kind of outline them because it's the 3 B's, and it makes total sense to me. When I say becoming knowledgeable, because many of us will say, you know, I thought there was something going on, but I didn't really know. And I didn't know what to do about this, what's happening in the United States today. And the reality is this has been going on since the 1700s. So it is not new. We're just becoming more aware of it, I think. Then, I don't think, I mean, I'm not the only one who thinks that, but the greater universe understands this. we're becoming more aware of it, and now we're understanding that there's are things that we can do. So becoming knowledgeable means becoming knowledgeable about the history of the United States. Why now? What does it really mean to this idea of Black Lives Matter? Don't all lives matter? Why are we saying Black Lives Matter? Really investigating and becoming knowledgeable about history, about where we stand at this time, what makes things different, but also understanding the vocabulary behind it. I'm a qualitative researcher by trade, and right now what I do at Johns Hopkins is we're doing research on families of color in independent schools, as well as using a particular method within organizations to help them become much more facile at talking about race. And we do focus groups. And what I'm finding is that among people of color as well as white people, people don't really have a common language for or understanding of what some of these words mean: diversity, inclusion, systemic racism, equity, equality. What do all these things mean? And why is it important for you to know what they mean? And so what I thought I would do for right now is just kind of talk about some of those main words that are important, because if we have an understanding of the word, then it's much easier for us to do something about the word. Would you agree? So for a good example is the difference between equity and inclusion. Equity and equality. We talk about racial equality, which is extremely important, but equality is very different from equity. And I know I'm seeing Jonathan and Lorna and Margot shaking their heads because they agree so much with this, but you'd be surprised at how many people don't understand the difference. Because equality means that everybody gets the same thing, which on its surface, on the face of it, it seems like that would be the thing to do, have everyone have the same thing. But the illustration I love to use is of, you might have seen it. There's this beautiful picture of these young children who are looking at a fence, and there's a baseball game going on the other side of the fence. And all of these kids are different heights. There are some short ones, there are tall ones. In this instance, some can't see over the fence. Others, because they're tall enough, can see over the fence. If we apply an equality lens to this situation, what happens is everyone will get one box. Now, for the tall child, it's going to be great. He or she can see over the fence, way over the fence now. For the child who's medium height, that one box may be just enough to get them over the fence so they can see. But for the child who's too short, that equality box is not going to be enough for them to see over. And for some, it's not just that they're on level ground. Some are starting below ground. So they're going to need a lot more boxes to see over the fence. And ultimately, what we'd like to do, if we were really dismantling systemic racism, we would remove the fence altogether. And everyone would have an opportunity to see the baseball game without hindrance. So when we talk about this idea of equality and equity, now you see the difference. Equity means, race equity specifically means giving everyone the thing they need to succeed, so that you're not having to think about your race, ethnicity, or culture. You have what you need to succeed. You have the schools you need. You have the kind of job training you need. That the school that you go to is not defined by the fact that your neighborhood doesn't have enough money to support your school if you're going to a public school. It means that all children get the opportunity to have a high quality Montessori education. Wouldn't that be something? That's equity.
Absolutely.
Now we talk about diversity, and said Val, but diversity is really important, and yes, it is, because what we know from tons of research, McKinsey in 2017 and some others have done some great research to demonstrate that a diverse workforce is more innovative, it's more creative, they make more money. So here's the reality: you can tap into this power that goes on when you have a diverse workforce. But diversity really is only about numbers. It doesn't mean that you feel good in your space or that you're being allowed to have a voice in your space. It just means that you know how many people of color there are, how many women there are. So it's just about numbers. Inclusivity, however, means that you're not just about the numbers, but you're all in this together, and you all have a seat at the table or a voice in the boardroom. That when you look at leadership is not just white males. That's a lot of individuals, because you've tapped into diversity. So this is how I like to say it. I like to say it's like going to a party. So diversity is having a whole lot of people at the party. Equality means that you've been asked to dance. But equity, Equity is helping you choose that you can help choose the music so that you're involved in the decision-making power. Equity is about power and being able to distribute power.
Mhm.
But then there's this question about this thing called systemic racism, because we hear about that a lot. You know, what is systemic racism? And systemic racism is the idea that the system is in place that continues to perpetuate the inequities that we just talked about. I'll give you a great example. And we probably talked about this the last time, but it really does fit in again for this time, about during World War II and the GI Bill. And many of us were really, I'm sure, John, well, all of us were beneficiaries of that GI Bill. And remember, the GI Bill for our parents was that they could get a house, you know, they could have education, that this was the biggest social effort that the United States had ever done. And on the surface, it was the most powerful. It created what we now have as the middle class. Without that GI Bill, when all those GIs came back from World War II, that because of that, they were able to push themselves into this middle class. Now, on the surface, it looks great. But here's the reality. Not every group was able to access the GI Bill at the same rate. So a white male who came from low poverty and low means could get a loan that was zero interest and with no down, right? So he could buy his house. But for those who were people of color, specifically Hispanic and African American, because of redlining, they couldn't get the loan. Yes, the bill was there for them, but the bank wouldn't let them have the loan. Now, this happened right after World War World War II. The implications continue because if you were able to buy a house in the 30s and 40s and 50s, then you could give the power, the money of that house to your children. If you were not able to get that, you were probably still in your substandard housing in your substandard neighborhood. Systemically, you could not pull yourself into that middle class, and you could see how it would continue to unfold. There are still, believe it or not, policies in place that seem like great policies because no one used a systemic racist equity lens to analyze it. They have not seen the benefit of that. So those are just some of the vocabulary that we all need to have in order to be able to really talk well about this topic. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, you know, Val, one of the things we talk about in the spirit of equity in Montessori classroom, we individualize education to meet each child's needs. We level the playing field. We just call it individualized learning.
Absolutely.
But we now need to think of it in our communities and in our public and private Montessori schools. Are we doing that on a demographic and curriculum level? Are we actually being equitable? Because we do it so well developmentally with children, we now need to apply the same principle, and we call it equity.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, for parents, I'm sorry, go ahead, Lorna.
Well, that's okay. Just to piggyback on what Jonathan said, one of the hardest things that I teach sometimes when I'm teaching adult learners that are in Montessori training is what I call the difference between equal and fair. And when you were talking about that, it really sounds like the same thing. I just use different words. But I'll tell teachers, you know, if you have a child that's maybe having a little difficulty, let's say sitting during group time, and you notice it's kind of a pattern, you know, and I say, well, why don't you, before your next group time, invite that child to just sit next to you during group time. And then that way you can put your hand on their knee or, you know, put your arm around their shoulder or whatever when they start to have some difficulty. And do you know that 9 times out of 10, they say to me, yes, but you know what? If you let that one sit next to you,
everybody, yeah,
all the rest of them are going to want to sit next to you. And I have to try to explain to them, all the rest of them don't need to sit next to me. So they're not necessarily going to want to sit next to me because they don't need to. But this particular child does need to. This particular child needs more support. And that's really kind of what you're saying. And it's interesting that that happens with adult learners who are going to be teachers. And it just shows that that's part of our way of thinking, you know, is that we don't get the difference between the two.
And here's the reality: language is so important, and that language is about. And Dr. Montessori talked about this all the time. Language is a precision. It's an instrument that we can use to express ourselves, and so to be able to understand why things are the way they are, we need the language to give us the ideas about that. And so as a parent, if I don't have the language, especially to relate that to my son or daughter, it's going to be much more difficult for me to relay my own personal beliefs. But that means I have to look at my personal belief system. So I need to know the language. I need to know the history so that I understand exactly what we're all meaning about this and why are we talking about this in the first place, and what's the history of the United States. But then that leads us to becoming aware of our own internal bias. And implicit bias, as you know, right? Sorry, go ahead, Lorna.
Well, I just wanted to mention that we do have somebody, one of our participants, who has a question. I think this is a question. Any comments of the book, The Coddling of the American Mind?
Yes.
Are you familiar with that?
I'm very familiar with that book. I tend to disagree with him on his premise. Yeah, so it's a very provocative book, and believing that it kind of still goes back to the we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps kind of idea. And I would say, in fact, I'm looking at it over here on my shelf. I got to hear the author speak about that, and I tend to disagree. I think he comes again from a position of privilege, and because he comes from a position of privilege, he doesn't quite understand it. And there are some really interesting points and perspectives that he has in there, but his idea that we can't talk about this because it's about hard work and effort. And totally understand that yes, we all have to have hard work and effort, but then make sure that all the pieces are in places so that my hard work and effort can look like your hard work and effort, and we can get to the same place. Don't burden me with extra stuff so that I can't get to that, you know? Don't make it so difficult. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, and about to go back to your fence analogy of watching the baseball game. So if you have a really short child who can make all the effort in the world to jump to see the game, if the fence is still too high and there's no two boxes to help them, it has nothing to do with personal effort. And that's sometimes where those of us who've grown up with white privilege forget. It's like, of course you have to make individual effort. Everybody does, regardless of their skin color, but you need to have an environment that supports it.
Yep. At least allow me the opportunity.
And this gentleman said also how good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure. And I would say it's more than one generation.
Absolutely.
It's quite a few generations. Yeah. He also, I missed his first comment, I'm sorry. He said, could be a slippery slope to, I think he means mediocrity, which starts well, but can end up with the same or similar inequality.
And I wish we could have a back and forth about that, because I would love for him to kind of expand on what he meant by that, because I'm thinking I understand, but I'm not quite sure. And what I think, again, I'd like to go back to is kind of what Jonathan talked about as well, and Lorna, you too. It's not that we're asking for more. We're asking to make sure that everyone has the same amount of opportunity.
Right.
And that opportunity is then put into place through policies and procedures that we could all depend on.
Yeah.
So that's the difference. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Margot.
In thinking about this and the analogy that you just made, I'm also trying to be mindful that in the current situation with COVID, and going to many schools having to do online learning and the challenges that presents in some demographic groups, where we think the solution is to just make sure that children have iPads or, devices to do their online learning, where those households may never have had those devices. We haven't maybe given enough attention to giving the children the toolbox they need to operate so that they're starting off not on the same level at the fence, they're once again below. So we have to make that accommodation to make sure that we raise them up so that they have the same learning opportunities with these new tools as well.
Interesting point. Interesting point. And there's so many inequities that have shown up because of COVID.
Yeah.
We could go on forever. So I appreciate that. Lorna, were you thinking of something?
Well, I see that our person, his name is Brad. I hope he doesn't mind if I use his name.
Yeah, hi, Brad.
He said, I learned about Let Grow from the book, The Coding, and then he gives a website for it. It's letgrow.org, actually. Has a strong message about preparing the child for the road, not the road for the child.
So interesting. And you know, what's interesting about that, and I don't know that well, so I'm speaking from ignorance in this point, but just the statement itself on face value just sounds so great if everybody had the same road. You know, so yes, you know, that's it's great. And yes, we're not saying that we should make it so that we should make it so, I'm trying to think of my thought. Let me move on to that. But we're just making sure that the road is we all have a same road, so that some roads don't have barbed wire and big holes in it, and the other road, you know, you can jump in your Ferrari and keep going. What we're asking for is that at least everyone has a road. You know, the road is completely blocked because of counseling. I'll give you a great example. Inner city public schools who have one counselor for 2,500 students, one college counselor. And where that counselor is exhausted and says to students, well, you know what, you really aren't ready for college, you know, so, you know, why don't you just go ahead and work for Safeway or whatever that is, because you'll never get there, as opposed to really looking for opportunities and for programs to support them. Whereas in other schools, in other districts, there are many school counselors in the school. So we're asking for you to for everyone to have the same road. That's what we're asking.
You know, Val, I'm wondering whether it's so easy at this time with this particular issue to drift into kind of anthropological binary thinking. It's neither only pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, nor is it totally environment. The two need to work together. Everybody needs to work as an individual, and you need to have, as we say in Montessori, a prepared environment, a supportive environment, an equitable environment to pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. So I think once we get into a tug of war with those two, we're forgetting that you got to have both. In Montessori, we have a prepared environment of learning, and then there's the readiness of the child and the willingness of the child to learn.
Absolutely. What a great metaphor. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lorna.
One more thing. Brad just wanted to comment that he agrees with all you're saying. He did mean, now see, this is a new word for me. That's why I'm confused. It's meritocracy. M-E-R-I-C-T-O.
So Brad and I are connected. Brad, I bet you've read American Meritocracy. And yes, it is a thing, right? It is absolutely a thing. And I totally agree with you that we've decided kind of arbitrarily what good is and what smart is. And I would argue in Montessori, we've really expanded the definition of what is smart. And it's not just about the merits of your educational process, but about what you bring to the community, and that we celebrate that within Montessori. And I think that takes us right back to that parenting piece, the parenting children so that they recognize that everyone that's coming to them is bringing some gift, and we just have to figure out what that gift is and be open and cognizant of what that gift is. That goes back to this idea of preparing yourself to be open to the gift. And that's when I say my second B about becoming aware of bias, that the thing with bias is that we are all biased. And it's, you know, we tend to think of bias as a negative thing, but the reality is that you have to be biased in order to function in the world and not hurt yourself. You know, I'm allergic to fish. I am biased against eating it, you know, because I will die, you know, and I am biased against, I can't even be in the room when it's cooking. My husband has gotten so sensitive to it that he knows or can taste it in food for me. So that there's a reason why we are created in the way that we are, so that this idea of bias. The challenge is, though, that bias can go astray. And it can go astray in that because our brains really want us to feel comfortable with things that look and act like us. And remember, we talked last time about that bias occurs very, very, very early. I was just reading some research that was talking about like months old, that we have to kind of undo that bias because we're living in this wonderfully rich, pluralistic society. So unwinding our own bias, or becoming aware of our bias, and then unwinding that bias so that we can appreciate all that this diversity has in store for us. And one way you can kind of see if you're biased is by doing the Harvard Implicit Bias test. And then Harvard would love it, because if you do that test, then they get more data. But it really becomes starkly apparent that we are all biased. That's one. And then two, look at your friend group, because your children are looking at your friend group as well. And if you make a list of your closest friends, the people that you trust the most that are not family, how many of those are different gender than you, different socioeconomic level than you? How many of them are different color than you, different race or ethnicity than you? That kind of tells you who your children are seeing you value. So my challenge would be to become knowledgeable about this issue of race in the United States, which is very specific. Become knowledgeable about the language that you're using. Become knowledgeable and aware of your own implicit bias. But then widen out your group, your associations, and have friends who are outside of who you would normally have friends. Who comes to your house for dinner? Well, nobody does right now. I mean, it's COVID. But, who do you call? Who are you going to go out to play golf with? I think about the time Margot and I keep talking about getting our husbands together to go play golf. Or who do you invite to the pool in your neighborhood or whatever? Can you widen that out so your child sees that, yes, in fact, my family embraces all of these individuals and we learn from them. When is the last time you went to a culturally different restaurant or a culturally different religious practice or whatever that thing is? Listen to stories being told in the library that are in a different language or culture. Opening up yourself and thus your children to experience this incredible panoply of race and diversity and ethnicity.
Val, since you used the term implicit bias, I think it's good to point out for all of us, you used the example that that you're allergic to fish. That's actually an explicit bias.
That's
that,
true.
you're conscious of it.
That's true.
If for some reason unconsciously, which I'm sure you don't do, you thought, well, I'm not comfortable around anybody who is in the fish industry, that might be an implicit bias. You are now extending your explicit bias to things that have no basis in fact, but it's an unconscious avoidance. And that's where it becomes really dangerous, because a lot of us, because we've had limited experience of American history or the experience of people of color, we walk around with these little biases thinking that this is the fact, and that's what we need to uncover.
And the challenge with it, and I'm so glad you clarified that for me, because I think what I was trying to go to a space and I forgot to define it. But the interesting thing is that we can say what is appropriate about him. We can talk about this, that I am not racist, I don't have these pieces, but we can act differently. Yeah. And there is the challenge. And that's because of it's implicit. It is kind of, our brains are wired now, and we have to literally unwire them. And the way we do that, and that's the bad news. The bad news is that it's there and it's kind of lurking in the backs of our minds, and we act on those, unfortunately. And many times we act on it in the direct antithesis of what we say. But we can unwind it by exposing it and understanding that we have it. Hence the implicit bias test, hence going and learning more about other cultures and kind of immersing ourselves in other cultures. And then if we stop and think and say, am I applying an equity lens when I think about this? And when I look at my what I'm doing today or who I'm supporting today, am I only supporting the same things I've always supported? Or am I opening myself up to try something new and different? Mm-hmm. Then my very last one, my last one is becoming an ally. And the reason I say that is because Kendi, in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, I think one of the things he brings up very well is that if we're not doing anything, if we're saying, I hear this a lot in my work, Val, I know I need to do something, but I don't know what to do, and therefore I don't do anything. well, then you're kind of allowing the system to continue to perpetuate itself. But there are things that we can all do, little things, little things. So things like listen and be curious. And that's going to push you to read more and to think more and to talk more about the topic. If we could actually talk about the topic, and you know what's really interesting is that I find that when people talk about race, they will very easily deflect and talk about gender. They'll talk about sexuality, they'll talk about religion, but we can't seem to stay on this topic of race because it's still too painful for us as a nation. But if we can get to that point to talk about it openly, that's huge. To ask questions, that's another way to become an ally. To intervene when you believe something is wrong. And when you intervene, your kids see it. And they recognize that, you know, to be an ally means you got to stand up. You've got to be out in front. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to march. It doesn't necessarily mean, but maybe it is financially supporting. Maybe it is saying to someone, I think that's not appropriate. That's the kind of thing that intervention. We talk about that in Montessori schools as all the time. We ask teachers to support students as they wrestle with this idea of injustice between their classmates. That's why we have a peace table, to bring it all to the fore, to intervene. And many classrooms, in many Montessori classrooms, there's a student who becomes the mediator and helps them work through this issue because they're intervening. So breaking the cycle and helping that to become a much more positive experience for both parties concerned. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Now, can you talk a little bit about how a parent can call somebody like another adult or call another child on an implicit bias that just comes out as an unconscious bias in a way that is not labeling, like that was racist? You know, how you strike that balance between, you know, calling somebody but in a respectful way so they don't feel demeaned and they don't get defensive.
Typically what I do is I tell people to become curious. Did you mean that? Tell me a little bit more about what you were thinking. Because 9 times out of 10, that's not really what they meant. But you can also say, if you think they meant that, you know, that seems really hurtful. Do you realize what that means?
Yeah.
You know, you can hear people say words all the time and you say, are you sure that's what you meant? Because this is what I'm hearing. Becoming curious and listening and also giving people the benefit of the doubt. The fact is that most times, most folks are not at all trying to be racist, but because they don't understand or know how it's being taken or heard, that's the challenge.
Well, I love that. I love that idea of asking people questions rather than jumping to judgment.
Right.
Getting them talking about why they said that and then gently sort of correcting their course. Were you aware that when you said that, some people will take it this way?
Absolutely. And we do that again in the classroom. I mean, that's a function of the classroom, not assuming you understand why the child is doing what they're doing with the material, but asking them a question about it to understand their thinking. And then you might learn something as well as you're doing that. Another really great example, I'm sorry, go ahead, Lorna.
I was just, it's so funny that we do it so comfortably with children, but when it comes to this issue of race, which we're so sensitive about, we walk on eggshells or we avoid it.
Yeah.
What a good point.
I think sometimes it's the emotional part of it too. You know, I remember my daughter, of course, went to well, not of course, but she did. She went to Montessori school. She didn't have a whole lot of choice about that. But when she got to high school, actually, she wanted to go to a public school, high school that offered a magnet program in the arts. And we didn't, you know, we couldn't offer that at our little Montessori school. So she went there, and there was a young man, adolescent boy, who she had been friends with for years because his cousin went to her Montessori school. And so she knew this boy. And he was a little bit feminine acting, and she was in a class with him. And the students, other high school students that were in this class, were chiding him, making fun of him, you know, really being abusive to him. And she was very, very upset about it because she liked this guy. She'd known him for years, and she didn't, you know, and it just wasn't right. So she actually went to her teacher and she said, how come when many kids are saying these things
Mm,
to
you
this
don't stand it.
to this kid in our class, to my friend? How come you're not asking them to stop, or
Mm.
having some kind of conversation about it? And she's, well, doesn't really matter. That was her answer to my daughter.
Wow.
So, and this was after class. So the next day she goes back to class again, and same thing starts happening again. And so she went up to the front of the room and she said, it really bothers me that all of you are, that many of you are hurting this person's feelings by the things that you're saying to him. And I would really like it if you would stop.
Wow.
And the teacher was right there, and she just didn't say anything. And I know that's not about race, but I know that,
What a powerful
when
story.
things happen that are wrong, somebody does need to stand up. And it's not easy. And she was very, very upset for weeks about all this happening. She would come home and talk about it and stuff. So we do need to be really brave, courageous.
Absolutely.
And your words really help, Val. And I'm with Jonathan, asking the question, not assuming that you know why. I mean, maybe some of these kids didn't even know why they were saying these things. Maybe it was just because the other kids were saying it or something, So I think that's really helpful, certainly for me.
Well, I think coming with a place of an inquiry is a Montessori trait.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Lorna, since you used the word brave, I'm going to use Val's mantra. It's not color blind, be color brave.
Color brave, that's right.
Yeah.
It's so powerful because it really is. It's exactly what Kendi, in my understanding, is talking about. It's like, it's not being a racist doesn't mean you're doing anything. Being an anti-racist means you're brave enough to change the pattern or call people on a negative pattern, and that's changing the tide. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yep. So this reminds me of another one of my books now. I think of Brad now. Brad and I need to compare reading lists. But Brad, have you read Brene Brown's Daring Greatly? When I think about Brene Brown's Daring Greatly, and she has the quote from Theodore Roosevelt about it's not the person who's just the leader, but the person who goes into the arena that's bloody. That's real leadership. And unfortunately, it can be, as you said, Jonathan, so eloquently, very uncomfortable to be in that position. So, but to be a leader, you will be bloody. And I'm willing to bet you that for your children, you've already done that. You've been the one who stood up when maybe the teacher didn't treat them properly, or a neighbor's child didn't do something for them, that you were willing to be bloody for that. This is the same thing. You're giving them the same, you're demonstrating what it means to be brave when you do these kinds of things. And thanks, Jonathan, for bringing my favorite quote into it.
Oh, I love that. Val.
Me too.
It's so funny to me, again, the dichotomy. If we were to ask any American parent or teacher, do you want children to find their own voice and to advocate for what they feel is right? Whether it's their classroom or their community, every parent would say, oh, absolutely. But then when it comes to race, it's like, yeah, but have you helped your child and encouraged and modeled for your child standing up and calling out racism when you see it, again, in a gentle and kind way? But, we'll say yes to the principle, but actually doing it makes people, that's where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah. And didn't Lorna just give us a beautiful example of a child who had internalized that fact? Yes. That's a Montessori child who stepped up and said, you know what, this is wrong.
Yep.
I don't care what and I went to an authority. I mean, I did what I'm supposed to do, and the authority did nothing. Now it's my turn.
Yep.
And that is what is that famous quote? They came for the Jews, and then they came for me, and there was no one left to stand up for me.
Yeah.
Right. This is what we're talking about right now. So asking questions, intervening, but then there's one more that you can take if you're taking these as incremental steps in terms of becoming an ally, pushing your own organization to think things through with an equity lens. So maybe there's an organization that you're associated with that are beginning to think about its diversity, equity, and inclusion. We call it DEI. Some people call it READY, race, equity, diversity, and inclusion. That's my favorite because it really does put race in the front. what are they doing and how am I supporting that organization? Maybe it's just joining up. Maybe it's talking to leadership and saying, have you thought about having so that we can make sure that everybody's voice is heard and tap into the power of diversity? That those are the things, and your child is watching you do that. Just like when you become part of your parent association in school. I used to tell parents I was a head of school for 20 years, more than 20 years. In fact, oh my God, I don't even want to think about how many years. But, fortunately, everybody in this room has the same experience, so I don't feel so old. But I remember saying to parents all the time that when you're part of the parent association, or you're volunteering at the carnival, or you're supporting the school in these ways, your child is watching you. You may never believe that, but 25, 30 years later, they'll say, Mom, I used to watch you do the Azalea Festival every year, and I can't believe you did that, but I know that you love me because you did that. Those are the things that they remember. They're watching you, and they're watching what you value.
Right.
And so as you've demonstrated, if you think about what is it that you value, what kind of world do you want your child to be a part of, start working for that world. And Montessori will give you so many opportunities to do that. I mean, I know that all three of Margot, Jonathan, Lorna, all of you have been part and parcel with helping families recognize how important it is to become partners with their school through their educational process. And it shows what you value when you do that.
Yeah. Thank you. Wow. We have 2 minutes left. If there's anybody in the audience that would like to comment or ask a question, now is the time. I don't, oh, wait, wait a minute, here we go. Okay, let's see, Brad. Brad says, yes, have read Brene. Not sure about that one. Okay.
Cool.
Then I have another person, a different person.
Okay. Go on, Brad. We'll have to compare reading list one day.
There you go. This is Tracy, and she says, beyond the inquiry, going deeper into the conversation about being racist rather than anti-racist, or rather than being a racist.
Ooh, I like that.
People's defenses go up when they believe they are being personally attacked. The work is for all of us to recognize that none of us have been able to escape the effects of racism in our lives and how it shows up in our actions and speech.
Beautifully said. Absolutely beautifully said. It's in the very air we breathe. And until we can name it, and that's what, there's a joke that says name it and claim it. Until we can do that, it's almost impossible to unwind the effects because we don't even know it exists. But once we can look at it and see it and label it, then it's much easier to say, okay, now I see how it's effective. Now I can change the policies and procedures. I can help my school by making sure that the admissions or financial aid policies are blind. All the kinds of things that you can do to support that.
I also love the idea of we can call somebody on a misunderstanding or a non-conscious bias, but that's not judging the human being. And again, we know as Montessori parents and teachers, we teach in our disciplinary methods, regardless of what positive discipline approach you take, we judge the child's behavior or misbehavior, but we don't judge the child.
Absolutely.
Intelligent, and we need to apply that same paradigm to anti-racism. It's like I'm calling you on what seems to be a thought pattern you have or what came out of your mouth, but I'm not questioning your humaneness.
That's right, which requires some humility, right, on both parts, on both parties' part.
Yeah, I want to just say, I don't think I mentioned this the last time we were on, but I have read a good book, and it's called Waking Up White. And for me, it was a wake up. I mean, it really was.
Get a wake up call for you.
So I don't know, but people, if you're interested, Waking Up White is an excellent book for many of us that are white, and probably for other people too. But it really brought home some things that I didn't even really I never knew, I never understood that just because I am white, I have privileges I have things that are in my life that may not have been in my life if I were of a different race, different ethnic group, a different anything. So it's an interesting look at ourselves. I want to read Brad's last thing before we go.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, John, this one's, I think, for you. He says there's a good sci-fi short film about racism, classically and future concepts. The video could be usable for classes.
And what's the name of it?
It's he didn't put the name, but I have the YouTube link.
Oh, I'd love to see it. Thank you, Brad.
So I'm going to copy. Actually, I'm going to copy this.
Excellent. Put it in the chat.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, if I can. Let's see if I can. I thought I
Lauren,
could.
while you're working on that, and since you shared a resource, a book that has really moved me, which is the other side of the white privilege coin, which is, as Val said, learning other people's stories, learning the stories of other cultures, people of color, really understanding what their experience has been. There's a wonderful book called Tell Me Who You Are.
That's a great book.
It's on the other side of my desk here, but it's a wonderful book about listening to people's experiences in cultures and races that we simply, as white people, weren't exposed to. It was a real eye-opener for me, and it shows me that I have to be a lot more proactive and assertive in requesting people to tell me their stories and their experience.
Well, since we're talking books, I have a couple, and then one that learning about the history of Native Americans in the United States is powerful, and thinking about the land that we're all living on was occupied land, whether we've actually occupied their land. That's been a powerful statement for me. But just since we're doing books, I have just three, not just three, but three that I'm wondering if Brad has read. One is called Fatal Invention. Hold on, it's called Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. Then the other, which sounds like it should be for teachers, but it's really for everyone, is called Promoting Racial Literacy in Schools. Powerful book, powerful book. And my third one is Working Toward Whiteness: How American Immigrants Became White. It was really because this whole idea of what is white, what does it really mean? It's a great book that describes the history of it. And Tim Wise is one of those individuals that I follow. He's an advocate who has been talking about this since the 60s, about this idea of whiteness, a white male who was a very powerful civil rights speaker. This really has the research behind it. So some interesting things to read.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm writing it down. Okay. Oh, we went over by a few minutes, but everybody, I did put that YouTube link in the chat area. So if you want to copy it, you can just copy it and probably put it onto your computer. I want to thank everyone for coming today and for joining in the conversation. Val, I particularly want to thank you for coming back again. We really appreciate your knowledge, your caring, your help with a topic that's really hard for many of us. So thank you so much.
I love doing it. This has been always so encouraging for me, and I love talking with you guys, and thank you for the opportunity.
You're very welcome.
Remember that Val is one of our keynote speakers at our November conference this year. We'll have information on the Montessori.org website shortly. It's a powerful event we're creating this year, live stream, so look for more on Montessori.org and for more of Val's work.
And I'll share with you some more of my research, which I love so much. All right. All right, take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye for now, everybody. See you next week.
Bye-bye.